Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we're going to examine the rise of the Franks, and in particular focus on the reign of the Christian emperor Charlemagne and his impact on the church. We're then going to spend some time looking at the mission work of Anskar, who was a missionary to the Vikings, and Cyril and his brother Methodius, who were missionaries to the Slavs. As we've mentioned before, the Battle of Tours in 732, Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, was able to halt the Muslim advance into Europe. His son, Pepin, was then anointed as king by Boniface in the year 752. And we can see here already a closer relationship between church and state. 2 years later, Pope Stephen II forged an imperial decree claiming that the Emperor Constantine had transferred authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope. This was called the Donation of Constantine, and this document was used at different times to support the claims of political authority by the papacy. Meanwhile, Pepin and the Franks had defeated the Lombards from northern Italy. In the year 756, Pope Stephen II received from the Frankish king Pepin some Italian territory and a promise of future protection. As a result, the Papal States were formed, and so the Pope became the ruler of a temporal kingdom. And then in the year 768, Charlemagne becomes king of the Holy Roman Empire. During the reign of Charlemagne, his rule further established the authority and power of the papacy. He also established a central place of learning at his capital, Aachen, which is just west of modern-day Cologne and Bonn in Germany. And through his influence, trained men set up schools across his empire. Despite being unable to read himself, he believed education was very important, as a letter to the abbot Bergolf of Fulda reveals. It's Charlemagne's emphasis on learning that laid the groundwork for future universities.
Be it known, therefore, to your devotions pleasing to God, that we, together with our faithful, have considered it to be useful that the bishoprics and monasteries entrusted by the favour of Christ to our control, in addition in the culture of letters, also ought to be zealous in teaching those who by the gifts of God are able to learn, according to the capacity of each individual.
In the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome, and some scholars say he was the first ruler of what would later be described as the Holy Roman Empire, while others say it was the German-born Otto I. The importance of the act of the Pope crowning Charlemagne signified that his rule was over temporal affairs and that his authority came from the Church. This was an act of legitimisation of his rule and also the rule of future kings, and thus revealing the increasing power of the papacy. In terms of the Holy Roman Empire, later the French philosopher Voltaire would quip that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Charlemagne set up his capital at Aachen, and it was later that in the cathedral at Aachen that the coronations of 30 kings of the Holy Roman Empire occurred. The effects of Charlemagne's rule were far and wide, and it's often called the Carolingian Renaissance. But in particular, Charlemagne had a major influence on the church and its relationship with the state. Part of this was that he encouraged learning and established centres for learning, but he also helped regulise the worship and liturgy of the church. He made laws establishing that preaching be in the language of the people. He ordered that Sunday be treated as a day of rest and that tithes were to be collected as a tax. He also reformed the clergy and monasteries. He saw the clergy as a means for reforming society and so worked towards this end. He appointed bishops, seeking men of quality to fill the positions, and he banned clergy from marrying, from visiting taverns, or going hunting. And he tried to revive monasticism and brought all monasteries in his kingdom under the Benedictine order. And during his time, his kingdom was extended geographically, and so the Christian faith spread. Although unfortunately, sometimes this occurred through coercion, such as the forced baptisms of the Saxons. The 9th century saw mission continue throughout the unevangelised areas of Europe. However, the century began with the death of Charlemagne in the year 814, and Louis, his son, ruled, and gradually the Carolingians lost power. Around the year 826, Anskar began his mission to the Vikings in modern-day Sweden. Around the year 863, Cyril and Methodius began their mission to the Slavic people of Moravia. Then in the following year, Boris, the king of Bulgaria, was baptized along with the rest of his people. But there were increasing divisions between the eastern and the western branches of the church. One debate was over the filioque clause, and the relationship hit a low point in the year 867 when Pope Nicholas excommunicated Patriarch Photius and the entire Eastern Church. Towards the end of the century, we begin to see increased corruption in the papacy. A particularly low point was in 882 when Pope John VIII was murdered, almost certainly by his own clerics. Added to this were threats to Western Europe from the pagan Magyar tribes who had risen in northeastern Europe. As we have noted, these centuries witnessed a number of threats to Christendom from outside pagan peoples, and one of these groups were the Vikings. There were people like Anskar who would bravely go to minister and to work as a missionary to the area of the Vikings. Anskar was a particularly influential missionary to the Vikings. We know about him from a biography by Rimbert, and it's called The Life of Anskar. Anskar was known as a man of courage, of piety and humility. He was educated at a Benedictine monastery at Corbie near Amiens in France, and he became a monk. And as a monk, he took on the role of a teacher and preacher. In the year 826, Anskar was invited to Denmark by the Danish king Harold. Now Harold had previously fled to Charlemagne's son, Emperor Louis, for safety, and while there was persuaded to accept the Christian faith. He went with a fellow monk, Ortbert, to Hedeby in the province of Schleswig. There they set up a school to train young boys as teachers, and 12 students were enrolled. There were a few people that were converted, and his care and concern for the poor and his preaching had a positive impact on those around him. But in reality, he had difficulty in spreading the Christian message. With King Harold's downfall in 827 and Anskar's companion Ortbert having died, the school for the sons of the courtiers that they had established was closed, and Anskar returned to Germany. One commentator said, he, Anskar, pushed against a door which was not yet ready to open. According to Rimbert, Swedish ambassadors came to the emperor, the ruler of the Franks, Louis Pius, saying that there were many in their nation who were eager to embrace the Christian faith. And the ruler promised that he would send them faithful Christian preachers, and so Anskar was chosen and given the task. Anskar set out to the island of Burka. Today it's about 10 kilometres to the west of Stockholm. This was an important Viking trading location. But despite many difficulties, Anskar believed in and relied on the providence of God. While travelling to Sweden, they were attacked by pirates and they lost all their necessary goods. And despite calls to turn back, Anskar continued on and went to Burka. Rimbert said, eventually they were conquered and overcome by the pirates, who took from them their ships and all that they possessed, whilst they themselves barely escaped on foot to land. They lost here the royal gifts, which they should have delivered there, together with all their other possessions, save only what they were able to take and carry with them as they left the ship. They were plundered, moreover, of nearly 40 books, which they had accumulated for the service of God. When this happened, some were disposed to turn and go back, but no argument could divert God's servant from the journey which he had undertaken. On the contrary, he submitted everything that might happen to him to God's will. With great difficulty they accomplished their long journey on foot, traversing also the intervening seas where it was possible by ship, and eventually arrived at the Swedish port called Burka. They were kindly received here by the king, who was called Bjorn, whose messengers had informed him of the reason for which they had come. When he understood the object of their mission and had discussed the matter with his friends, with the approval and consent of all, he granted them permission to remain there and to preach the gospel of Christ, and afforded liberty to any who desired it to accept their teaching. Accordingly, the servants of God, when they saw that matters had turned out propitiously as they had desired, began eagerly to preach the word of salvation to the people of that place. There were many who were well disposed toward their mission and who willingly listened to the teaching of the Lord. There were also many Christians who were held captive amongst them and who rejoiced that now at last they were able to participate in the divine mysteries. Herigar, who was the chief royal councillor, was converted, and subsequently he built Sweden's first church in the year 832. Through Herigar's conversion and other efforts, Anskar was able to plant other churches, and he stayed at Burka for 18 months. He then returned to take on the Archbishopric of Hamburg. Recent archaeological excavations have revealed a large Viking hall that was built in the early 9th century. According to archaeologists, this Viking hall or mansion was owned by Herigar. Herigar continued on by himself And there are a couple of stories that Rimbert mentions regarding miracles that took place through his life and witness. One recounts the miracle of rain falling on the pagans and not on Herigar. On another occasion, Rimbert said that it happened that Herigar was suffering a great pain in his leg, so that it was impossible for him to move out of his place, except when he was carried. When he had endured this distress for some time, many persons came to visit him, some of whom urged him to sacrifice to the gods in order to regain his health, whilst others assailed him with jeers, saying that his illness was due to the fact that he had no god. It said when he could no longer bear these reproaches, he asked his servants to take him to the church. And while there, he prayed, "My Lord Jesus Christ, grant to me, thy servant now, my former health, in order that these unhappy men may know that thou art the only God, and that there is none beside thee, and in order that my enemies may behold the great things that thou doest, and may turn in confusion from their errors, and be converted to the knowledge of thy name." And after having said this, he was forthwith healed by the grace of God, and was made completely well. He accordingly left the church unaided, and rendered thanks to God for his health, and strengthened in the faith of Christ, he more and more confounded those who disbelieved. So having spent 2 winters in Burka, Anskar had returned to Emperor Louis Pius to report that progress had been achieved. As a result, the emperor decided to make Hamburg a centre from which to develop missionary work to the north, and he arranged that Anskar should be consecrated as its bishop. With the help of Emperor Louis Pius, Anskar built a monastery, a church, a library and a school at Hamburg. Later, Pope Gregory appointed or set apart Anskar as a special missionary bishop. The mission in Sweden continued when Gortbert was consecrated as bishop. He laboured there as a missionary for many years, but in the year 845 he was attacked and driven out of the country by the pagans. Then 5 years passed. Anskar was concerned for his spiritual son Herigar, so he sent a hermit called Ardgar to assist as a priest there. So in 850, Ardgar arrived and laboured at Burka for over 10 years. Meanwhile, our Lord and Master diligently executed his office in the diocese that had been committed to him, and in the country of the Danes, and by the example of his good life, he incited many to embrace the faith. He began also to buy Danish and Slav boys and to redeem some from captivity, so that he might train them for God's service. While Anskar was at Hamburg, there was a Viking attack in which the city was pillaged by an army led by the king of Jutland. The whole country was laid waste, and nearly all the Christian churches were destroyed. Rimbert said, "Everything which was used in the services of the church and all his treasures and possessions were lost by pillage or by fire during the enemy attack. This attack left him practically naked, as nothing had previously been taken away, nor was anything removed at the time except that which each fugitive was able to carry away with him. By none of these things was our Holy Father distressed, nor did he sin with his lips. But when in a moment of time he lost almost everything that he had been able to gather together or to collect for purposes of building, he repeated again and again the words of Job, 'The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away, the Lord's will has been done. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" In the year 853, as a response to a vision that Anskar had, he returned again to Burka in Sweden. On his arrival, he found the new King Olaf and his subjects debating about how they should honour a new deity. Anskar requested that he might be allowed to preach the Christian faith to the people, and the king said that lots should be cast in order to discover whether it would be right to do so. And the lots proved favourable to Anskar, and he was allowed to make a proposal before the General Assembly of the people. It was decided at the assembly to allow the mission to continue, and so Olaf allowed a chapel to be built. Anskar remained in Sweden for about a year and returned to Hamburg in 854. On his return to Denmark, Anskar once again found that there had been opposition to his work. However, things changed, and he received from the new king a grant of land at a place called Ripper in Jutland to build a second church. In returning to Hamburg, he found a number of Christians had been carried off as slaves by some of the pagan tribes. Anskar was really distressed about the situation, and he went and found the chiefs who were responsible, and after making pleas, persuaded them to release all their captives. Despite the many setbacks that Anskar had faced during his lifetime, Archbishop Ebo said of his missionary labour, "Be assured that what we have begun to do in the name of Christ will bear fruit in the Lord. I know of a truth that we have begun amongst these nations will never be entirely obliterated, but by the grace of God will bear fruit and prosper till the name of the Lord reach unto the ends of the earth." In his biography of Anskar, Rimbaud mentions that many times Anskar received visions or dreams prior to him taking on a task. When one of Anskar's followers suggested to him that he could work miracles, Anskar humbly replied, "Were I worthy of such a favour from my God, I would ask that he would grant to me this one miracle, that by his grace he would make of me a good man." Unfortunately, the death of Anskar brought the worst setback of all. The faith that he had tried so hard to spread hadn't been firmly grounded, and so Christianity virtually disappeared from Scandinavia, and so those who came after him had to rebuild almost from scratch. In the year 864, Boris, the king of Bulgaria, was baptised. There are a number of versions as to why he had converted to Christianity. Some say it was through the intervention of his sister, who'd already converted while being at Constantinople. Another mentions a Greek slave in the ruler's court. And another says that it was a deliberate, practical and political act. However, his sincerity may be seen in the fact that he later gave up his position as ruler and became a monk. Boris introduced the Christian faith to his empire, but sadly, sometimes it wasn't always peaceably done. To assist the work in Bulgaria, Formosus was sent by the Pope to work among the people there. Formosus later became Pope and died in the year 896. After his death, he was accused of perjury and having acceded to the papacy illegally. The infamous cadaveric council was held. Pope Formosus was disinterred by Pope Stephen VI. He was dressed in his papal robes, paraded through the streets, before being put on trial. He was found guilty, and afterwards his body was mutilated and thrown into the Tiber River. Two influential missionaries that were from Constantinople in the east were Methodius and his brother Cyril. The brothers were born into a wealthy Christian family at Thessalonica in Greece, and Methodius was about 12 years older than his younger brother Cyril. The boys were originally named Michael and Constantine, but later changed their names to Methodius and Cyril. From an early age, the young Cyril showed evidence that he was a child prodigy, in particular in the area of language. After a number of years, Methodius was sent away to be trained as a lawyer and left Thessalonica. He eventually became an important civil official in the territory of the Slavs. After their father's death, many years later, Cyril, while only a teenager, was sent to the imperial court at Constantinople to study. There he soon became a respected scholar. Later, he was ordained a deacon and was employed as a librarian at the most important Christian library in the empire. Eventually, he became a professor of philosophy. Meanwhile, Methodius, tired of his civil work, joined a monastery at Olympus, and he became a monk, and then later the abbot. Around the year 860, Cyril, and possibly also Methodius, were sent by the Byzantine Emperor Michael III and by Patriarch Photius to be missionaries in the area of the Khazars, which is in modern-day Kazakhstan and southern Russia. On their way, they crossed the Black Sea and arrived at the city of Kherson, which is now part of Ukraine. In their stay there, Cyril learned the Hebrew language and translated 8 parts of their grammar. Eventually, they arrived in the area of the Khazars, where they found the people were predominantly Jewish. They were both brilliant linguists, but Cyril in particular, and he soon learnt the language of the Khazars. During their time there were some professions of faith, but no lasting foundations were made. Then in 863 they became missionaries to Moravia, after a request from King Rostislav to the Byzantine Emperor Michael and Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. King Rostislav had tried to forcibly convert the Moravian people, and he had not been successful. The area of Moravia was under the religious jurisdiction of Rome, and there had been some unsuccessful Catholic missions there, partly due to the fact that they didn't know the Slavic language. So Rostislav wanted missionaries with that ability. So he sent a special delegation to Constantinople to Emperor Michael and Patriarch Photius. Despite being tired after his work with the Khazars, Cyril, in this quote, shows his positive attitude towards this missionary task in Moravia. However tired and physically worn out I am, I will go with joy to that land, and with joy I depart for the sake of the Christian faith. Cyril and Methodius would receive a special dispensation to work in this Catholic area. This time, Cyril and Methodius had some success in their mission work amongst the people there. Because of their knowledge of the Slavic tongue, they conducted services in the native language. They, principally Cyril, formed the written form or script of the Slavic language. The script was then used to translate the New Testament and later parts of the Old Testament. As a result, they were regarded as pioneers in the use of the vernacular. The script has links to modern-day Bulgarian, Russian, Serbian, Bosnian and Croatian, and is known as the Cyrillic alphabet, named after Cyril. As mentioned, Cyril then worked tirelessly translating both the New Testament and parts of the Old into the Slavic language. Long before Wycliffe, Luther and Tyndale, Cyril faced opposition for putting the scriptures into the language of the people. The Roman Church only accepted one translation of the scriptures, and that was in Latin. In response to this, Cyril said, "Do not all breathe in the air in the same way? Are not ashamed to decree only 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek and Latin, deciding that all other peoples and races should remain blind and deaf?" Cyril and Methodius had arrived at Velirad in the year 863. Now Velirad is in the modern Czech Republic. Because they were ministering in lands nominally under papal authority, they had opposition from a German Catholic bishop and other German clergy who thought that this was their area to minister in. In the year 868, Cyril and Methodius went to Rome, where they received special dispensation from Pope Adrian to continue their work in Moravia. However, Cyril died while still in Rome in the year 869. Cyril, on his deathbed, reportedly said to his brother Methodius, "Behold, my brother, we have shared the same destiny, ploughing the same furrow. I now fall in the field at the end of my day. I know that you greatly love your mountain, but do not, for the sake of the mountain, give up your work of teaching." With Cyril's encouragement, Methodius continued the work and was then called by the Prince of Pannonia to work there. Today, this is the area of northern Yugoslavia, covering the countries of Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Hungary. This area was still technically under Catholic supervision. However, with Pope Adrian's support, Methodius, who was acting as a papal legate, became the Bishop of Sirmium, which today is in Serbia. He was to be responsible directly to the Pope and not the German Catholic clergy who still opposed him. His work also covered all the territory of Moravia. Methodius's influence spread to other areas such as Bohemia, and then later he became the Archbishop back at Velirad. However, in 870 he was imprisoned for 2 years by the German clergy. His release eventually came through the intervention of Pope John VIII. He was allowed to return to Moravia, but faced some restrictions. For example, the liturgy was no longer to be in Slavic, but he was allowed to preach in Slavic. Then, in the year 879, Methodius was summoned again to Rome to face accusations by the German clergy. The accusations were that he was continuing to use a Slavic liturgy and was leaving out the filioque clause in the creed. Methodius subsequently returned to Constantinople to complete the Slavic Bible that he and his brother Cyril had started. Methodius then returned to Velirad, and he died there in the year 885. Shortly after Methodius's death at Velirad in 885, opposition to the work of Cyril and Methodius intensified. Pope Stephen IV called for the total banning of the Slavic liturgy, and a papal legate arrived at Velirad to deliver the pronouncement. The followers of Cyril and Methodius were expelled from the city, and their works were to be burned. Their followers travelled east into other Slavic lands such as Ukraine, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic. Cyril and Methodius are considered the apostles of the Slavs. Today, the liturgical language of the Russians, Serbians, Ukrainians, and Bulgars is that designed by the two brothers. Apart from being regarded as pioneers in the use of the vernacular in the liturgy, they are also viewed as patrons of ecumenism. This period also saw an ongoing conflict between the eastern and the western branches of the church. There was a particular falling out between Pope Nicholas I and Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. In the year 850, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals or false decretals were produced by a clergyman at Reims in the west. These forgeries claimed to be ancient documents. They were designed to provide justification for the rights of the Roman see or Roman bishopric over others. And this document was used by Pope Nicholas in his conflict with Patriarch Photius. There was initial conflict over the appointment of Photius when he was rewarded with the position of Patriarch by Emperor Michael III. Michael III had removed Patriarch Ignatius, and so Ignatius in the year 859 had gone and appealed to Rome for support. In 863, Nicholas excommunicated Photius at a synod of Rome. Photius, in response, accused the Latin Church of heresy over its interpolation or addition to the Nicene Creed, as well as its insistence on clerical celibacy and other ritual peculiarities. In the following year of 864, he excommunicated Pope Nicholas. Now, the disagreement over the words of the Nicene Creed was because the Western Church, if you remember, had inserted an extra clause known as the Filioque clause into the creed. The disputed addition is highlighted in this quote, which says, "We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father." And the words "and the Son" were added in. Now, the contention was over the question, did the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father through the Son, which was the Eastern position, or from the Father and the Son, which was the Western position? Now, this conflict between Nicholas and Photius was resolved somewhat, but still divisions existed. Throughout this century, there were other important theological developments in the East and the West. In the West, there was an increasing acceptance of the perpetual virginity of Mary, and this had been an issue that had been discussed as early as the 5th century. We also begin to see the first clear statement on the idea of a real presence of Jesus in the Lord's Supper. And this view would lead to the doctrine of transubstantiation. In the East, we see the emergence of the Paulicians. The Paulicians were a Gnostic group, and they were possibly influenced by Manichaeism, as they were dualistic, believing there was a good and an evil God. And like Marcion of Sinope, they only accepted parts of the New Testament. There were also significant political and cultural changes during this time, particularly with the development of what is called feudalism. Now, after the fragmentation of Charlemagne's kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire was split into 3 parts. And generally speaking, across Western Europe, most kings from this time onwards weren't strong enough to keep order, so they relied on the allegiance of wealthy landowners called lords, or sometimes nobles, to do so. and these would pay tax to the king. Now, these larger landowners in turn cut their large holdings into smaller areas, and these were run by lesser lords who would in turn pay a tax to their landowners. And then underneath them were the poor farm workers called peasants, and these were the people who worked the land. There were also some freemen who dwelt in the towns, but both groups had to pay tax to the lesser lords. What were the implications of feudalism? Well, the authority of the kings was limited and decentralised, and the king was no longer an autocrat but relied on the loyalty of his lords. And this enabled the Roman Catholic Church to challenge the king from time to time. And so the next few centuries witnessed a struggle for power between the church and the state. We've now come to the end of our video on the Franks and the missions to the Vikings and to the Slavs. In our next video, we're going to look at some of the corruption that existed in the church, and we're looking also at attempts to reform it through the monasteries and some of the political leaders, for example, the Ottonians. We'll also note the expansion of the Christian faith through new Christian kingdoms, and conclude with an evaluation of the significant split between the Orthodox and Catholic branches of the Church in the year 1054.